Now, in this section, we'll be dealing with the pathophysiology of death. Now, death is basically, we'll give an overview of death, and then we'll be discussing the types of death, and finally and foremostly, the brain death and how is it confirmed the brain is dead. Because when the brain is dead or the brain stem is found dead, it means that the person is legally dead. So that has to be found very confirmatively in that phase. So how do we basically define death? Failure of a body as an integrated system associated with irreversible. Now, it is the highlight of this definition. This is an irreversible change, the irreversible loss of circulation, respiration, and innervation. Now, basically, when you're asked in any viva voce examinations or any written examinations, what are the modes of death, this is what you have to discuss. There is a loss of circulation that is highlighted as the syncope. Now, the respiration is highlighted as the asphyxia, and the innervation, the irreversible loss of the innervation, that is the brain death, is described as the coma. So basically, that is the whole, the syncope stage and the comatose stage and the asphyxiated stage. All of these basically are the modes of death. So they are really important, and they are basically the highlights of this definition of a dead person. Now, coming on to the types of death. Now, basically, what we are dealing over here is, first of all, we have the somatic death. Now, the somatic death is basically the same as I've already discussed in the definition of death, the irreversible and the complete loss of the functions of the respiration, of the heart, and the innervation. That is basically defined as the somatic death. The cells of the body, other than those already damaged in CNS, are alive and functioning. So at this stage, basically, whenever the somatic death occurs, the cells of the body are still alive. The tissues of the body are still working because of the oxygen supply that they already have in storage. And that can vary from person to person. The condition of the body, the atmospheric conditions, all of these contribute to basically the time of the molecular death that will occur after that, which is also known as the cellular death. So we have two types of death. One is the somatic death, and the other is the cellular death, which is also known as the molecular death. Now, the cellular death is basically what happens here is the tissues and their constituent cells die. Now, this almost variably, it can change, but normally the time duration that occurs after the somatic death, how much time does it take? It's almost 3 to 4 hours that the body will be cellularly dead as well. So these are the types of death, and they're really important. Why are they important? Now, it has a medico-legal significance as well. And secondly, the transplantation factor. When we are going to transplant the organs, for example, the liver has to be transplanted 15 minutes after the somatic death. And the heart can be transplanted 1 hour after the somatic death, whereas the kidneys, they can be transplanted 45 minutes after the somatic death. So all of these has a clinical significance as well, and they have a medico-legal significance as well. So we have to consider all these factors over here. Now, the somatic death, the complete and irreversible stoppage of the circulation, respiration, and brain functions. I have repeatedly told you in the earlier slides that these 3 points, that is the stoppage of the circulation, the stoppage of the respiration, the stoppage of the brain functions, these are basically the modes of death. So when you're asked what are the modes of death, these are the modes. These are the modes of death. And the cause of death is basically different. When you are asked what is the cause of death, how will you define that? The cause of death can be accidental, it can be suicidal, and it can be homicidal as well. So they are different entities, and we have to describe them in different details. Now, important in resuscitation and organ transplantation. Now, the resuscitation, obviously, you have to clinically set up a point whether we have to resuscitate this person or not. So if you know that a person is somatically dead, but he has time, he's at a molecular and a cellular level, he's not dead, so you can try out for resuscitation. And organ transplantation, the heart, the kidneys, the liver, they have different time periods, and you have to consider them at different clinical levels. Now the brain death, the types of brain death. The first of all, we'll consider the cortical or the cerebral death, and then as the brainstem death, and finally we have the whole brain death. Now, initially what happens in the initial phases when a person dies, the cortical or the cerebral death occurs. That is followed by the brainstem death. Now, the brainstem death has a lot of clinical tests. We can perform a lot of clinical tests over here, and we have to administer whether a person is dead or not at this level. We can perform the apnea test first of all, and one of each of the reflexes of the brainstem test can be performed at this level. It includes the vestibulo-ocular test, the pupillary reflexes, that is discussed in the later sections in details, and that will confirm whether a person is dead or not. And thirdly and lastly, when the cortical, the cerebral, and the brainstem, all of them are dead, we consider the person's whole brain death, and that establishes the death of the person at the cortical level, at the cerebral level. So these are the types of brain tests, and they have to be, its diagnosis is wholly clinical, on clinical tests, and no chemical or biochemical tests are performed at this level. Now, as I was talking about the absence of the reflexes with the pathways to the brainstem, so what are the tests that we can perform over here? First of all, the pupillary reflexes. We'll check the pupillary reflexes. They are darned or they are lowered down at this level. The cornea becomes opaque at this level. It is there are a lot of opacities due to debris, cellular debris. It can be dust particles as well. And there are a lot of other corneal changes. There can be cat hill tracking. At this stage, we can examine that as well. And that will start to perform. So these ocular changes are also basically a part of this diagnosis of death that is going to be performed. The pathways that we are going to check over here in the brainstem is the vestibulo-ocular pathways. The light reflexes have to be checked in the pupils. And these are all of the these are all of the clinical tests that will basically establish the brainstem death of the person, that will clinically and legally establish the death of any person. After that, the announcement to the relatives is to made that the person is dead. So that was all for this section. We discussed the death in detail, the definition, the types of death, and how will you basically clinically diagnose whether a person is dead or not at the cortical levels, at the brainstem levels, and all of these phenomena are discussed in detail. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.